And now it's time to bring on our guest, Zephyr Ali, who is the Senior Director, Petroleum Supply Chain Products for AspenTech in Houston. And we're also being joined by Ron Beck, Marketing Strategy Director for AspenTech. Gentlemen, welcome to In the Oil Patch Radio Show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Ron, you are one of our favorites. You've been on the show many times, and obviously you handle a lot of the marketing for AspenTech. But Zephyr is new to the show. And Zephyr, I'd like to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself to our listeners. Tell us a little bit about you, what you're doing there, and your background. How did you come to AspenTech?
Sure. So I've been in the industry for over 25 years now. I have a background of chemical engineering. Oil and gas is where I started back in 1997. I have done different kinds of roles. I was in, solution consulting before. I did research and development to a large extent. I was also one of the key architects of our planning and scheduling solution. And recently, in 2010, I moved into product management, and now I'm responsible for the strategy and the vision on how our products should evolve to better cater to this market.
It sounds like a lot of responsibility in staying up to date on everything that's happening and so quickly. AspenTech is one of these high-tech companies that are really helping find efficiency for companies in the energy sector in the way of digitalization. I want to talk a little bit about some of the situations and problems that are occurring in the area of refinery. So everybody's very familiar with the rapid drop in both product pricing and demand. In February, we saw a loss of course, the price of the barrel of oil, and then to make matters worse, COVID-19 came right behind it. And there is such uncertainty, and of course, this trying to figure out how to recover as of today from both of these different really bad negative impacts to our industry has really put plants in a place where they're trying to adjust to these new challenges, if you will, and how they're using technologies to adapt to help them better recover in these different areas. Tell me a little bit about the plants and their specific situation. We've talked a lot about energy sector. Let's move over a little bit and switch gears and talk about refineries. What are their specific problems?
Yes, so refineries, as you know, have been around for a long, long time. And the primary purpose of a refinery, just for the edification of your users, is that it takes the crude from the ground, the thick stuff that comes out heavy, and then it breaks it down into products that can be used for actually pumping our airlines, the gasoline for our cars, the diesel for our trucks and rail cars, and obviously bunker fuel for our ships. So at the end of the day, you take something that's coming out of the ground and make something which is much more useful for the human population. And this has been the task for a very long time. The market used to be quite stable in the sense that there was a set demand or kind of slightly increasing demand over the period. And the prices do fluctuate, but not dramatically. What has happened over the last few years, and I think we call it the Vuca Environment. This is a term that has been around for a while, which means volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That Vuca environment is only getting worse in the sense that the demand fluctuates quite a bit, the supply changes quite a bit, the price as a consequence of that obviously goes all over the place as well for a cost. So the refineries that could be making money today could be losing this year tomorrow. And they need to be extremely agile and extremely resilient to cope up with this dynamic market and to make sure they can survive for a longer time.
Whether you're up, mid, or downstream, meaning obviously refineries are going to fall in the latter part. Technology and using it, some of these plants, and Ron and I have had this discussion over lunch, is, some of them are very old and they've been around for a very long time. And they are kind of clunky in the way that they are used to doing things. They've always done it this way, and looking and seeing how can they do things differently. Planners work today, and they are at the center of these plants, and they have the need to become more agile and faster in their reacting. So talk to me about these planners. What's their specific role, and how can they become more efficient?
Absolutely. So this is actually a critical role in a refinery operation. And to give you a little bit of a background of what a planner typically does. So when you're trying to run a refinery, you need to come up with a plan. And the plan typically is for, 3 to 4 week time period. And this obviously changes if some of the assumptions change. So you're trying to predict the future. You're trying to come up with a robust plan that can cope with some of the changes that may occur in the future. So a planner, what his decisions is making is, obviously, as you can imagine, in a market, in a free market, you have a lot of feedstock options to choose from, right? Now, each of these feedstocks will process differently in your refinery. They'll produce different kinds of products. So that's an important point. The second point is that obviously your refinery has or will have some constraints in the foreseeable future. So you need to obviously properly account for that. And then you have a market that you're catering to. So the demand from that market could also fluctuate. It could be seasonal. So, the gasoline could be higher consumption in the summer versus the winter.
Right.
So what a planner typically does is he tries to figure out what's the optimum way for A, to buy the best feedstock for his refinery, obviously based on the price. And then second, the most optimal way to operate his refinery or his or her refinery so that he's going to produce the right amount of products so that the products can then sell to the market that he's catering to. So at the end of the day, the bottom line for the planner is to maximize the refinery margin. So all these decisions are up for grabs, and he needs to make sure that he generates a plan that maximizes his refinery margin. So that's the key role that a planner does.
Got it. Well, we're getting ready for a break. When we come back, I want to drill down a little bit more into how can these planners be more agile and efficient, but I also want to bring in engineers as well, because they kind of are necessary as well to have a discussion on what role are they playing. You're listening to an Oil Patch Radio Show, and we'll be right back. And we're back. You're listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. Our guest today is Zephyr Ali and Ron Beck, both with Aspen Tech. Guys, before the break, we were talking about planners and, of course, refineries. A lot of, these refinery plants, they've been around for a very long time. And it is time for all refineries to be moving into modernization, if you will. I just don't know how they survive without it. And there's a lot of reasons why they probably should be efficiencies, but then also maybe it's downtime, national security, all these different things come into play. I want to drill down a little bit more, Zephyr, and talk about, there's all these things are changing today with technology. Explain to me advanced planning models and why are they more accurate, and does the company need to be able to run scenarios more quickly to be able to find if they're going to go down? Somehow or another, hearing that a refinery is down does not seem good to me. Obviously, it's not good for the refinery, but also the impact of not being able to operate doesn't seem very efficient. So tell me a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So as you may notice, we are working in a very, very different environment of the market that the refineries are built to actually cater to.
Right.
To give you an example, the demand for gasoline in April and May basically plummeted. And nobody was buying gasoline. There was actually an example, one of the customers that I talked to, where the gasoline at their gate was negative. So they were actually willing to give money for you to take their gasoline off their hands, primarily because since it was not being consumed, they have limited tankage capacity. So they could not store these gasolines that are being produced in the plant. So, and the cost, by the way, of shutting down a refinery is humongous. It's multi-million dollars. So nobody wants to shut down the refinery. What they want to do is they want to make sure that they can minimize the production of things that are not selling. So this is an example where gasoline was basically not selling at all, but diesel production or actually demand for diesel went up. But the problem is that you really cannot make diesel without making gasoline. That's how the refinery is designed. So these are some of the key challenges that the planners and obviously the operations are dealing with. Now let me talk a little bit about advanced planning and scenario analysis. So when a planner is sitting down and trying to plan for the next 3-4 weeks, by the way, that frequency has gone up dramatically. In the past, they used to do it every 3 to 4 weeks. Now that is happening every other day. In fact, I've had examples where I've talked to customers where the kind of workflow they did on a monthly basis is now happening on every 2 to 3 days. So the executives are asking them questions about, okay, what if this happens? Or what if that happens? Those changes are an order of magnitude more dynamic than it used to be in the past. So if you're trying to evaluate a scenario and see, okay, if I do this, will I make more money? And if you do not have an accurate representation of the asset that you're trying to plan for, it's almost like, okay, you don't exactly know how your plan will behave, and you're literally running blind. So that's where the advanced planning models can help you. So the accurate representation of the asset is absolutely critical for you to analyze the right scenarios and quickly, but more importantly, be fully aware of the what-if scenarios.
Okay.
Yeah, so Zafar, if I could just jump in, Kim. So if you think about it, if you're running, let's say, 100,000 barrels a day through a refinery, even a few cents of difference makes a big difference in your revenue and your margin. Mm-hmm. So that's where the accuracy comes in. And I hear from a lot of refinery managers, we need your help. Why? The planners keep saying they're doing a good job, but why does the actual performance this month not match up with what the plan was at the beginning?
Well, and the technology, I would assume, is taking out the guesswork for that senior executive to not, and I don't mean this against their team, but the data is not going to lie. The data is going to support either it's really efficient and it's moving along or it's not. And this is where the technology comes in to be able to help them make better decisions of where they need to pay more attention to in being able to make better calls on efficiency, correct? In some ways?
So technology actually does help in two different dimensions. One is the efficiency. Mm-hmm. So as I said, right, so now the number of scenarios that the planner needs to evaluate has gone up a couple of orders of magnitude. So to give you an example, I've talked to some of the planners. They were running half a dozen to a dozen scenarios in the past. Now they're running, 300, 400 scenarios because it's so unpredictable in the future. That's the first problem. Now, if they take, for example, 2-3 hours to run half a dozen scenarios, and if you multiply that by 100 times, they do not have that kind of time. So that's where things like cloud or high-performance computing can come in and help you. So you can now run many more number of scenarios to be more accurate in what you're going to predict. The second thing is from a technology perspective, is the data science element. So if now I'm looking at, instead of 6 scenarios, I'm looking at 1,000 scenarios, humanly it's impossible for me to go and decipher all the kind of insights that I need to look at. But the data science could then come out and say, by the way, these are some of the key gems that you need to focus on because for whatever reason it's very different from what you've done in the past, or for example, the margin is significantly higher. So it basically takes some of the grunt work from planners and moves it into more AI land.
Yes, efficient. Okay, when we get back from break, I do want to specifically get on specific cloud computing and other things that are being utilized. You're listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show, and we'll be right back. And we're back. You're listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show. Our guest today is AspenTech, our company, and we're being joined by Ron and Zafar. Guys, before the break, we were discussing the planners and how the refineries have really been undergoing a massive change to become more agile and more efficient. And a lot of the technology that's emerging is allowing them to do this. And earlier, Zafar, you were talking about how some of the refineries are actually using specific products to help them cloud computing. So let's talk about artificial intelligence and how it is changing the way that planning of the work that they're utilizing it. In what way are they utilizing it now? And really also, how are they going to use it in the future? What do you all see coming for refineries?
That's a very good question, by the way. So AI and cloud computing are going to be much more prevalent or pervasive going forward. In fact, the first thing that we have done in the past is obviously the cloud computing. As I mentioned earlier, the number of scenarios that a planner was typically dealing with used to be in a few dozens at most, and now they're in hundreds and potentially even thousands because the uncertainty and the Vuca environment is kind of forcing them to do it. Mm-hmm. So that leads to obviously the understanding of the solution. Now, as you can imagine, in a given 8-hour day, humanly it's impossible to look at all this data to kind of figure out where the data error could be coming from, because wrong data, pricing data, or any kind of demand data or supply data could mess up your decision significantly. So where AI starts playing the role is data sanitization. So it goes in and looks at the historical data there that you have entered, and it kind of weeds out the data that looks suspicious or kind of looks odd or different from what historically you have done. The second element now is, and this is where Ron can also add a lot to it, is that the models that you've got for your refinery or for your asset, AI can significantly augment it. So what we are trying to do as Aspen Baking, one of the innovations that we are driving now is we are very good at, the physics of the model. So we have these first principles models that have been around for decades and very, very, very structured, very, very proven. But what we realize is that data science or AI can augment these models, make them much more accurate, much more easy to calibrate, and obviously much more responsive to the real-time scenario. So that's another area where AI is significantly going to augment our decision-making process. And the third element, which is now the ability to say, okay, I've gotten all these scenarios, I've analyzed what I'm seeing the future is going to be looking like, and how do I figure out what's my most robust decision to make? That's, again, where AI can help and say, okay, look, I've seen these scenarios in the past, and by the way, here are some of the key ones that you need to focus on. And by the way, I find some errors in these scenarios, etc. So AI can literally augment the human in making better decisions, faster decisions in the timeline and in the environment that we operate in.
Zafar, if I could just add in here quickly. So that's where it's very exciting, the idea that, what we're doing, we call it industrial AI, where you democratize the use of it into let's say a refinery. So this will allow let's say the smaller refiners, or what you'd call boutique refiners, smaller plants that don't have the staffs to do all of these workflows that probably even sound complex explaining them simply. But how do you make that all happen very quickly and much simpler, so that like Zafar said, the engineering models that can access the plant data, make them more accurate and quickly put them into the planning models so that what the planners get is accurate and gets them a few more pennies on the dollar.
One of the trends that we are noticing, by the way, to Ron's point, is that the experience of the staff is going down, so the demographic change. So now you've got younger engineers and planners that do not stay in their role for more than 3-4 years, because that's the Gen X trend. In the past, people were in their role for 20, 30 years, so the chance of making an error was minimized. So that's where the AI can augment. So it brings in the experience element and demystifies the experience element and kind of lowers the bar to make a planner more effective.
Changing gears just slightly, but as we go show by show, a lot of similarities come in, and one of them is you mentioned Gen X, you mentioned, we'll talk about millennials. They really have a odd way of looking at the oil and gas industry, as it's a dirty, blue-collar, non-tech, and it couldn't be further from the truth, especially with companies like what you guys are doing that actually would appeal to this Gen X generation, if you will, that you have all the modern technology and more in this sector. So you necessarily don't have to go to Silicon Valley to work in a high-tech field. You have it right here in good old Texas and good old oil and gas. I wonder if you'll give me an example, Zafar, of today's plants, some technology that they're using in their environment.
Absolutely. So I think the couple of things that the buzzword people talk about, AI. AI is basically a glorified way of doing regression, or basically trying to represent a model, build a model with some data, right? And by the way, we have been doing that for the last 20, 30 years. We just didn't call it AI. It's a marketing buzzword. So I would like to say, and I think, Ron, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that oil and gas industry has been using AI for the last 30 years. We just call it AI now. That's the first example. The second example is that now this oil and gas industry has a huge amount of data. It's almost primed to be exploited. And I think we are at a point with the fourth industrial revolution, where we can transform this industry, make it much more safe for the environment, much more profitable for the end users. Because at the end of the day, let's face it, our quality of life is dependent on this oil and gas. It's not necessarily about the fuels, but it's about the petrochemicals that we use, the pharmaceuticals that we use. The key components for that industry is actually coming from oil and gas. So we really cannot live without oil and gas.
Of course.
So it's in our best interest.
Right.
It's in our best interest to help modernize this industry and take it to the next level.
Excellent. When we come back from break, I want to talk a little bit more about the digitalization in the plant, but then I also want to bring it back to full circle of being able to, you guys explain to us how operations, management, engineering, how they all come together and bring it all together in this remote type setting. We do have to take a quick break. You're listening to In the Oil Patch Radio Show, and we'll be right back. And we're back. You're listening to in the Oil Patch Radio Show. Our guest today is Ron and Zephyr, both with Aspen Tech. We've had a lot of discussion on the way that refineries are moving to modernization using digitalization and all these new technologies that are evolving and emerging. And of course, Aspen Tech is leading the way. Let's drill down and talk about digitalization specifically in the plant. Put this in some kind of context for me, Ron or Zephyr, so we understand a little bit more how.
Yes, every refiner, whether they're a very large global company or own one refinery, everybody's talking about digitalization. Question is, what does it mean and why do you need to do it? And so definitely everybody understands over the last 3 months. Zafar was talking about cloud computing, letting you harness very high computing power to run many scenarios. There's another big element to that, which what refineries discovered over the last couple of months is, the planner needs to work from his kitchen table this week. How do we give him access to the software? And actually a lot of our teams, luckily, we have all the tools available in our software for people to be able to do that. A lot of companies hadn't really progressed, though, and we helped them. Our customer service people, our CEO got many letters from customers talking about how we did yeoman work to help them, enable them to do this work from home and remotely. So that's part of digitalization. But the other big part is a lot of these areas have been automated for years, but even in a refinery where everybody's working in one building on that refinery, the engineer and the maintenance person and the planner and the scheduler, they didn't work together. They were all automating, but individually. And so digitalization is, how do you combine that all and actually give the window to the plant manager and the executive as to what's really happening in his environment?
So I can add to this, right? So what is happening, if you think about a good analogy, is the self-driving car. And I believe very strongly that, in fact, Aspen Tech has a vision, a very strong vision. Our CEO is kind of leading this. It's called a self-optimizing plant. I think it is going to happen. It's
a
inevitable.
self-optimizing plant.
Yes, a self-optimizing plant.
Wow.
I think it's inevitable. It's a matter of time. We're working towards it. To give you an example, right? So if you think about a self-driving car, there are 5 different levels of self-autonomy. The level 1 is called foot off. So you can keep your foot off the accelerator and the brake, and the car kind of drives it. So it's kind of a cruise control. Level 2 is hands off, right? So you kind of keep the car in its own lane. Level 3 is your eyes off. So now you can literally do whatever else you want. The car kind of drives on its own, kind of, but you still have to pay attention. And level 4 is that the mind's off, and level 5 is kind of drive off. The car kind of drives off for you. I think the plant is going to also evolve in a similar fashion. So the example that Ron was giving you is where automation has happened in some of the large units, especially the coker, et cetera, the big units. The DMC, which is our advanced process control technology, has automated some of these units, but they were still working in silos. Nobody has fully automated the entire plant. I think that's where the technology is going to move. I think there's a lot of work in that area that's happening. Aspen Tech is leading some of the work, but other companies are also doing it. In fact, some of the big oil majors are also doing it. I think that is going to become a reality. I think digitalization is going to be the core of that, because if you think about the self-autonomous car, you've got to have good data, you've got to have good models, you've got to be able to make decisions quickly, you have to be able to make autonomous decisions. The humans only get involved with an exception as opposed to making all the decisions. So I think that's where the trend is going to evolve into. Do you agree, Ron?
Absolutely. And that's, by the way, for your audience, eventually when it gets fully democratized, because you can have a small plant and you can achieve as much as people can with a big plant, because as Zafar said, the people are doing advisory work rather than having to have lots of people running around looking at all the data points.
Yeah, and to give you an example, COVID, right? So now a lot of these plants that had hundreds of operators running it is running the same capacity with a third of their human workforce in the plant. And that has actually opened the eyes of many organizations to realize that, it's probably safer, it's probably better to automate some of these, so you can actually eliminate some of the human errors that are happening as well. I'm not saying that you will run without human. But I think the human, then you elevate the decision-making capability of the human, so he or she can make better decisions in an efficient manner.
So, what I've heard between both of you all is, COVID-19 affected how companies did their business across, the spectrum of all the energy industry. When we interviewed Mike Howard last week, his discussion with me was, we've never been here before, and we had to rise to a challenge of something we had never even practiced for. And listening to, how are they going to do it remotely and do it efficiently and do it safely to protect their workers as well as their company became challenges that it seems like the show is talking about. The time has arrived. It's here right now.
Yes.
And we're looking
Exactly.
into the future, and it has actually changed the way companies are going to have to do business. And,
It has accelerated it.
Yeah, it's accelerated it, and now we're here. And I also got to say that, many shows we have done, I've never had one that has been so futuristic of what's coming. And I look at it and I think this is an amazing opportunity for the energy industry to really look and see, you have everything, and this isn't going to change. But I also think it opened up the eyes of a lot of executives, their boards, their leadership, to see, we thought it was 5 years down the road. It's here now, and we have to figure it out now. And you guys, it's good to see that you're not just focusing, today's show evolved around refineries, but you guys are focusing around upstream operators, midstream refineries, and then of course you're a global company too. But the fact that you're able to help in the digitalization in all these different areas to impact them to be not just energy efficient, but also being able to look at where we are because of COVID and how long will this continue to last. They're going to have to make some really severe, or I wouldn't say severe, but some real changes quickly to adapt to something that looks like it's going to continue on a little bit longer for survival, if you will, of these
Every
companies.
cloud has a silver lining, right? I think this is the silver
There
lining.
you go.
of this
For
cloud.
something bad that
Exactly.
happens, there's always something good on the other side. Well, gentlemen, thank you so
Exactly.
much for joining us today. I really enjoyed today's show, learned a whole lot, and I feel so excited to see what the future holds with all of the energy sectors and being able to go digital and using more AI technology.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
In the Oil Patch is where together we explore topics that affect us all in oil, gas, business, and in your community. Every week, your host Kim Bellotto will visit with the movers and shakers in this fast-paced industry. You'll hear from industry experts, elected officials, and many more right here on In the Oil Patch.